thank you everyone for coming along to the second session this morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Victoria Kingston. I'm a co-founder of the festival with Simon, who did the introductions earlier. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Catriona Beaumont to the History Festival. She's Professor of Social History at London South Bank University and a visiting professor at UCD. And a lot of her work concentrates on the history of female activism in the 19th and 20th centuries across Britain and Ireland. And she wrote an article a couple of years ago in which she talks about discovering what her grandmother did during the Civil War. And that sort of got her interested, I think, in her family history. But she's also going to talk, as well as that, about a new project she's working on, looking at the afterlives of activist women in Ireland, but also in Finland and Germany. And this feeds into one of the things at the festival we're trying to do, is sort of broadening out conversations about Irish history to look across Europe, which I think Professor Gavart was doing earlier. So I'll hand over to Kate. I know some people at the back couldn't hear everything earlier, so please, if you can't hear, say, because we don't know if you can't hear. Thank you.
So, thank you. I'll just test that you can hear me. Yeah, is that all right? So if I move, as one does, moves around a bit, just wave at me or something and I'll hone back in here. Right, so I think my first slide is there. Right, okay, so many thanks to Victoria and Simon for the invitation to speak here at the West Cork History Festival. It's a first for me and I'm having a really wonderful time thus far, so it's lovely to be here. And thanks to all of you for coming out this morning to hear primarily about my grandmother, Maureen Beaumont, and the new international research project, Afterlives, uncovering the life stories and contributions of activist women in the wake of revolution and civil war, Ireland, Finland, and Germany, 1918 up in and around the 1980s. And this project has emerged out of this foray into my own family history, and that has been really lovely. So the new project is funded by London South Bank University, as Victoria said. That's where I'm a professor of social history, and it's supported by UCD, where I'm a visiting full professor for the next 2 years. And we held the first workshop for this Afterlives project in June this year at UCD. At that workshop, we had 9 scholars from universities in Ireland, the UK and Finland, along with representatives from the Irish Countrywomen's Association, the ICA, and Seroptimist Ireland, which is a really important women's organisation that many people haven't heard of. Seroptimist means the best of women, and they had a big international conference in July in Dublin, so there's kind of coverage of that. But I'm going to talk a bit more about my work with the ICA and the Seroptimists later on. So what's coming up in my paper this morning is, so it's over there, I was going to read some of the slides, but they're too far away, so I'm just going to have to try and remember what's on them. So there is a beginning, and the beginning is, I'm going to talk a bit about my grandmother. There'll be a middle, and that's when I'm going to talk about the Afterlives project. And then, so you're not panicking, there is an end, where I'm going to talk a wee bit about what next for that project, I think. So I really can't see what's on the slide from here. I think that's what it says. So on that slide, you can see a photo of my grandmother, Maureen McGavock, and then subsequently Beaumont. And that's a photo of her as a young woman. And then alongside that is the death notice that appeared. We don't know which paper, it's a cutting. Very frustratingly for historians when people don't write what the newspaper was and the date. I'm sure that's driven some of you here mad as well, but they don't. So if you ever cut newspaper cuttings out, always put the date on. We really appreciate that. And that cutting was given to me by one of my cousins in November last year. And even as late as that, I was quite surprised to see her identified as a Cumann na mBan veteran. That still surprised me, and that's kind of the essence of what I'm going to talk a wee bit about this morning. So it didn't quite fit with what I remembered or what I understood about my grandmother's life. And that's because her involvement in Cumann na mBan was something that we didn't discuss in my family when I was growing up. And I suspect that some of you here in the room today have a similar experience with members of your own families. And again, this is something very much at the heart of some of the work I'm doing now. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Maureen, my grandmother, and here she is. And these 3 photos nicely encapsulate Maureen's life. The first image is, I don't know, I'm not going to try which law, I get very mixed up with my rights and lefts anyway. So anyway, the first image is of her in her Come on the Mawn uniform. And she would have been around 1923. I've worked out through a bit of detective work. We think this was taken in late 1916, early 1917. So she would have been around 23. And as you can see, she's perched on a bike with a fishing rod in one hand and a rifle in the other. And this is the photograph that has provided the impetus for the Afterlives project that I'm now working on. The second image is Maureen's passport photo, and we have her passport at home in Dublin. It's from 1954, and she would have been age 60. And interestingly, though perhaps not unsurprisingly, she described herself on the passport as a housewife. And that's despite the fact that she was doing many other things at that point in her life, but housewife is what she put down. So this is important, I think, and a lot of my other work is around organisations representing housewives, so this was very interesting to me. And then the third photo is her with me, that's me, I'm the little one. I was 5 years old, and it's in the back garden of our family home in Sandymount in Dublin. And this was taken the summer before she died, so she died age 77 on the 19th of January 1972. And because my sister Helen is here, over there, who's just given a brilliant paper over in the boathouse about her work in the National Museum of Ireland and their programme for the Decade of Centenary, here is Helen with my grandmother in the same garden. There she is. And Helen, that was around 1965, so you were doing about one. I've just aged you now, Helen, so sorry about that. Right, so just to go back to these three images. So the image of Maureen on the bike with the rifle and the fishing rod. Hang on a minute. The image of Maureen with me in our back garden as your archetypal granny, that's the image that I had remembered of her. And we were very close, and she lived in the same house, and she was the granny who advocated on my behalf and who I would run up to her end of the house if I needed to be protected from cross parents or annoyed big sisters. I'm the youngest, big sisters. So she was always to me my beloved Mamo, which is what we called her, the Irish for granny. And this was always my predominant memory of her was as this grandmother. Until many years later, in 1988, and many years after she had died, I was researching my MA dissertation in modern Irish history at UCD on the Irish women's movement from the 1920s to the 1940s. My work was based, it was interesting the fact that there didn't seem to be one, and of course I knew there must have been one, so that's what I did my dissertation on. And I discovered in the archives that Maureen had been involved in several of the women's organisations I was researching, namely the Irish Country Women's Association, the ICA, and the National University Women Graduates Association. And when I mentioned this to my dad, Pierce, he told me that she was also a member of Come on the Mawn, something which I hadn't been aware of previously. It was clear to me even back then that my dad, was uneasy talking about his mother's involvement in Come on the Mawn. So I didn't pursue the matter, and I carried on with my own research, which focused on women's organisations in Ireland and then later Britain, later into the 20s, 30s and into the mid-20th century. And I left my grandmother's story pretty much alone. It's worth noting, however, that Eve Morrison, who's here and who'll be speaking later, Eve did once call around to our family home to have a look at we didn't have many, but some of the papers that we had of my grandmother's. And I think you used that in your doctoral research. Is that right, Eve? Yeah, yes. But again, so I knew this was happening, but I wasn't involved in any of this at this point. So, as I say, although I knew that Come on the Mawn featured in my grandmother's past, I didn't think much more about it until around 2016, when my cousin Eamon O'Kissoin shared this photo of Maureen on the bike with the fishing rod and the rifle. And this surprising and unexpected image stopped me in my tracks. It made me think again about my grandmother's life, her experiences, and her activism. I now wanted to know more, but at that time I was busy teaching, I was working on British women's activism by then, and I was bringing up my own family, so I didn't pursue it particularly, but also I was very conscious that my dad continued to be uncomfortable, and he was uncomfortable with this photo, and he wasn't that keen on it being shared widely. He saw it as more of a private image of his mother. So I was very sensitive and cognizant of that, and I shied away, therefore, for any further investigations. So this situation changed in 2021. Out of the blue, Mary McAuliffe, who I'm sure you're familiar with her work of UCD, got in touch to ask if I'd be interested in speaking at a symposium she was organising to mark the centenary of the Cumann na mBan Convention in 1922. This was the event that led to the organisation splitting over the Anglo-Irish Treaty, with those supporting the treaty leaving Cumann na mBan to set up a new organisation, Cumann na Saoirse. So Mary's invite finally gave me the opportunity I had been waiting for to engage directly with my grandmother's involvement in Cumann na mBan, her activism during the War of Independence, and her life after the turmoil of the early 1920s. However, there was still the issue of my father Pierce and his feelings to be considered. So what had changed though, and there had been a definite change in this regard, was the state-sponsored decade of centenaries. With its events, TV documentaries, publications and exhibitions, which Helen has just been talking about, all that work previously, all of these activities opened up a new space in Irish society for conversations and debates where one hadn't existed before. And this meant it was the right time to start talking about Maureen, her life and her contribution to Irish history. So it was in this new context that I asked my father would he mind if I began to write about his mother and shared this photo of her with the rifle. And I remember sitting down in our kitchen at home and sort of being slightly anxious about this conversation, but when I explained to him that I was interested in researching her whole life in the round, as it were, and not just her involvement, not that just a snapshot involvement of her activities with Cumann na mBan, he was much more at ease, and he gave the project his seal of approval. So following on from the symposium at UCD, I wrote an article about Maureen for the online journal The Conversation. If none of you are familiar, or some of you may be familiar with The Conversation, it's an absolutely brilliant resource where journalists come together with academics to make our work more accessible. I think that sometimes that can be really important. And universities subscribe to it, and journalists work with you. So I worked with a great editor, Paul Keaveney, and together we produced this article. So I published this article, and it was a longer piece, so it's a 4,000-word essay. So I published this, and I asked for permission, obviously, to use the photo of the image with my grandmother with the rifle. I was a bit apprehensive about how it would be received, and that wasn't only by my dad, but by other family members. But thankfully, I got a very positive response from all quarters. And my dad was very happy with it, and this was particularly important to me, as sadly he died earlier this year. So it was really great that he got to see his grandmother's legacy acknowledged in this way, and that was important, I think, to me and the rest of the family. So, what was Maureen's involvement with Cumann na mBan, and how did she contribute to the War of Independence? So I'm still working to piece together Maureen's activities during the revolutionary period, and we have quite a blank, I think an intentional blank on her part. She has left no record of the Civil War. So this is a grey area. We have quite a lot about what she did in the War of Independence, but I think there's a silence. She obviously was involved in some way, and lucky enough I have a sabbatical for next semester, so I'm going to be mostly, hopefully, based a lot in Dublin and trying to do some detective work to find out what she was up to during those years. But what I do know so far is a lot of it gained from her witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, which you can see the cover sheet there. And of course, that's a wonderful online resource which is available to all. And rather unfortunately, Daniel, who Aetius, I think it's the pronunciation, he's speaking over in the boathouse, but no one's to leave. Okay, if you want to, I will remember if you walk out now to go and hear Daniel's paper. But he's speaking about that wonderful, wonderful resource for historians and for the public, which is really special. So Maureen, in May 1950, submitted a witness statement to the Bureau, and in that she recalled that in 1915, a year before she joined Cumann na mBan, she stored 2 violin cases containing ammunition and revolvers in her halls in Dominican Hall, Eccles Street. For disclosure, I should say that is not the violin case. That is an image of a violin case I got off the internet, and actually if you open that up, there's a little mini cocktail bar inside. So I don't think that was what in my grandmother's one. I mean, who knows? But anyway, so it's not the actual violin case. So she was living in Eccles Street in Dominican Halls because she was a student. She was an undergraduate at UCD at the time, studying for a BA languages degree. So she stored these arms at a request of her friend Godfrey J.J. Ginger O'Donnell of the Irish Volunteers. And it's very likely she was well connected in volunteer circles because her uncle was Owen McNeill, the founder of the Gaelic League and the Irish Volunteers. So she was within those circles. You may know Owen McNeill, probably much better known than my grandmother. Often is the case that men are better known than women in history. But he went on then, of course, to be pro-treaty and to be a member of the New States government. And there was a family rift, so Maureen's mother fell out and didn't speak again to her brother Owen. So, and again, that's not an unfamiliar story, and I'm sure some of you have experienced that in your own families. And then just as an aside, by coincidence, Daniel, who is over in the boathouse, he is speaking also about JJ Ginger O'Donnell, who by lovely coincidence turned out to oversee the the Bureau of Military History, and was in charge of that up until his death in 1944. So there's lovely synergies going on here. So in Maureen's witness statement, she says that she hid the violin cases. She doesn't say where, so I'm imagining maybe under the bed. And that they were picked up in 1916, just before the Easter Rising. Now, she was out of Dublin during the Easter Rising, as she was in Belfast for her Easter holidays. As a university student, she was on her Easter break. But on her return to Dublin, she joined the UCD branch of Common the Mom. She quickly became an active member, as described in her witness statement, and this involved drilling and first aid training, and the first aid training was put to good use when in 1918 she recalled that during the bad flu, as she put it, obviously we know that's the 1918 flu pandemic, she worked in a voluntary Common the Mon clinic set up in Dublin city centre to assist the general public as doctors and nurses were busy dealing with those suffering as a result of the pandemic. So first aid and voluntary nursing skills were core activities undertaken by women in Common the Mon. And as you can see here from an application form kindly shared by the UCD archives, it gives a sense of what is required for members of Common the Mon. Now, I can't read this off now because I can't see it, it's over there, but I did look at it earlier, and I know that horse riding, either side saddle or not, why, who knows, riding a bike, being able to drive and repair a motor, fishing, I think, is on it, being able to speak fluently in Irish, as my grandmother did. They were fluent Irish speakers. And there's a number, sorry, you can see I can't, I'm just trying to remember now. So it's really interesting, though, that these are the requirements that women needed to have. Now, I don't know if my grandmother had all of those, but she certainly had many of those, and therefore was eligible to be a member of the organisation. But I just love the idea that there was an application form. So I sometimes think that we think of these things as all being quite random and unorganised, but clearly there was a bureaucracy. And of course, bureaucracy is wonderful for historians because bureaucracy leaves records. And then these are the trails that we can follow. So in November 1920, Maureen was co-opted onto the executive committee of Common the Mom. And as part of her duties as an executive committee member, she recounted in her witness statement that she had to travel around the country at weekends to organise meetings. In these recollections, there is an undercurrent of danger. The women sometimes had to stay up all night because it was unsafe for them to book into hotels, or hotels wouldn't have them, and because this was during a period of war and they could have been picked up by the authorities. Or worse things could have happened. So there was definitely inherent danger in these activities that women were undertaking at this time. Sometimes, again, not fully appreciated when we're thinking about the histories, which we tend to think of the male experience. So this is important. And she also, the more practical experience comes out in some of her recollections here as well, because she said that as well as these discomforts and dangers, they also had to make sure that they were back in Dublin as she was living to be at work on Monday morning. So we often don't associate women with work and then mixing these activities and juggling these activities. So she had to be back in work, and at the time she was working as a teacher in Scolbreda, which was the Irish language secondary school for girls, which at this time during the War of Independence was a hive of Republican activity, and lots of meetings and lots of key figures were meeting there and discussing strategy, and it got raided a lot as well by the authorities. So in her 2021 pocketbook, which we're lucky enough to have in the family archive, this page I've just picked from it. Unfortunately, there's not that, ooh, wasp. There's not that much in it. Sorry, go away, wasp. All right. Okay, outstaged by a wasp. Oh no, he's still there. Hang on. I think he's supposed to not move, but I can never do that. If you hear a squeal, it's because he stung me. Okay, so in the pocketbook, you can see that she made a trip to northern counties in August 1921, when there was a truce. So there was the truce, the War of Independence, which then eventually led to the peace negotiations, which led to the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty. So as you can see on the slide, I don't know if you can see, sorry, I can't quite see how much you can see, but there's a list of the meetings, and she was touring around Antrim and Tyrone, but really beautifully coincidentally, it's this week 102 years ago. So we can feel I know exactly what my grandmother was up to 102 years ago this week. And she lists the meeting that she was attending as an organiser, and then on the other side of the page there's a 7-point list that obviously was a reminder for herself to what she needed to cover at these meetings. And it lists the various activity. It's about providing safe houses and field dressings for male members of the IRA on the run. But also it emphasises the points of kind of the ethos of Cumann na mBan, which was discipline, punctuality, silence and courage. And this is what members were supposed to adhere by. So it's very clear from the evidence that we have that Maureen was very embedded in Cumann na mBan and Republican networks by 1921. And further proof of this can be seen in this now very well known, perhaps many of you have seen this image before, it's widely available on the internet. This is the wedding of Republicans Tom Barry and Leslie Price. And Leslie Price was a fellow executive member of Cumann na mBan, so obviously a friend and acquaintance of my grandmother. The wedding took place in August 1921, so my grandmother must have returned quite speedily from her trip up north, organising these meetings, back down to Dublin for the wedding. And there she is, and I can't point, sorry, my arms aren't long enough, but I don't know if you can see her name. She's sitting on the far, it's on the far right, so it'll be your left corner. I think is she named in the picture? Sorry, Helen, I can't see it. Is she? Circled it. Yeah, she circled. Okay, sorry, thank you. No, that's Michael Collins. He wouldn't have liked that. No. This side, yes. So my right. Thank you. Yep. Yeah. And she's got a big hat, so she's quite in shade. Now, what interests me about this photo is it's quite, there's lots of, she's not even named. So sorry, this is from, I got this image, there's various images of it. I got this from the Southern Star online. And you can see that it had listed the names of the key figures. Obviously, she's not named there. And we didn't know she was in this photograph. This photograph's also quite known for the fact that Michael Collins is ducking down because he didn't want to be recognised because he may have been picked up. Some smart Alex have said he's on his phone, but which I thought was quite funny, but clearly he's not. So my grandmother is on the side now. She's wearing the big hat, and we have one actually. Indeed, Helen, my sister, and I have wondered. Was she also? Was it deliberate that she had a large hat that kind of puts obscures her face? Because we'll see another example of that in a minute. I'm not sure, but there she is. She's sitting next to Harry Boland, and the other key figures is Michael Collins, obviously, who's circled. There's Leslie Price, the bride and groom, and Tom Barry, and then there's talk about why is De Valera sitting between the bride and groom? Did he feel he's that important? He needed to be there in the photograph. Who knows? And then this version of the photo is a wee bit cut off. So on the other side, the opposite side to where my grandmother is sitting, is Countess Markovich. And Mary McSweeney is also in the image. So this really famous photo. And so we had no idea. And how many times do you look at photographs and you know the famous people, but you don't know who are all those other people? This is something, and we didn't know that our grandmother was one of these individuals. And how we know is that my cousin found in a box of photos, in his mother's house, my Aunt Helen, her version of this photo, and she'd written all the names on the back, as she did with all her photos. So we know that's her sitting over there. Rather poignantly, many of the individuals that you see in this image, who were friends clearly, attending a wedding together during a truce in the War of Independence, they ended up fighting each other on opposite sides in the Civil War. And indeed, we know that a number were killed. Michael Collins, Harry Boland, and others were killed during that period. So, yes, sorry, that other picture coming in a minute. Right, so, whoops, there we go. Right, so Cumann na mBan was the first Republican organisation to vote on the treaty and split, as I said earlier, over its terms. And this occurred at a convention held in Dublin on the 5th of February 1922. And in this photo, another very well-known photo that you can easily access on the internet, we see the executive of Cumann na mBan sitting together. I'm presuming it's before the vote on the split. I'm not sure. I wondered, would they have sat together after? I'm really not sure, so I'm making that assumption. And then once again, Helen and I, we had looked at this photo, and it has been shared. I know Mary McAuliffe had tweeted and others had. So we knew this photo was around, and we knew our grandmother was on the executive at this stage, but we didn't know which woman she was because she was never named. So I had started to try and through elimination, wonder, and I had, and I'm not just making this up, I had thought that the woman who it turned out she was might be her because I kind of worked out who was who. And then amazingly, my cousin once again found a copy of the photo in his mother's belongings, and she had written the names on the back. And that's the list you can see there on the side of the photo, and she has M. McGavick, myself. And so the woman who I thought she was her, and that was wonderful. And you know, these lovely, this enthusiasm I now have for family history, which I'll talk a wee bit more about towards the end, is really, it's really very exciting. So, so we had known that she, and sorry, I think her name is on that slide, I think, so you can see her. Again, quite a big hat, no idea if that's done purposefully, is it just the fashion, or was it perhaps just to slightly obscure her face? So she attended the 1922 convention, and we knew this, but what we didn't know is that she spoke at the convention, and she gave a very impassioned speech to the convention, calling on Cumann na mBan to reject the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And it was when I was preparing for the UCD symposium, I quite accidentally came across Maureen's speech. I just Googled in sort of convention, and I came across the National National Library of Ireland's website, and they had digitized the minutes of that convention. And you scroll through, as you do on digital minutes. And I was kind of doing this fairly, you know, thinking, oh God, I need to get this paper written. And then I found a speech by Miss McGavick. And that was, again, a really exciting moment because I had no idea that she had spoken at the convention, and nobody else in the family did either. So I came face to face with my grandmother's words, captured forever by a minute taker. So never, you know, slag off minute takers. They're very, very important people. So reading her words to the convention gave me a new insight into just how deeply she opposed the treaty. And that was justified by her fear. She justified it by her fear that compromise would prevent the establishment of an independent 36-county state. And in her speech, 33-county state, and in her speech she implored, and I quote from her speech, "If we accept the treaty, we will never get a republic." So reading her speech and thinking of the photo of Maureen with the rifle, it dawned on me that my grandmother was one of the women labelled as furies and diehards in the wake of the Irish Civil War. And this is a very common reaction, and became a sort of an overwhelming reaction to anti-treaty women in particular. This is a very gendered response to the women who remained anti-treaty after the Anglo-Irish after the Anglo-Irish Treaty was approved and the new state was founded. And sorry, I can't read again because I can't see the slide, but you have a speech. Oh, apologies, I'm one behind. That's the minute taker speech of my grandmother's speech to the convention. And here is the speech. So on one side you see the first president of the Irish Free State, W.T. Cosgrave, in his New Year's Day speech on the 1st of January 1923, he deliberately targets the women who are the diehards who seem to seek out destruction, sheer destruction. So this is an incredibly negative portrayal of these women. And this trope, this idea of these disruptive, these furies, P.J. O'Hegarty also kind of fueled this debate and discussion, and it was really widespread in the papers. And work has been done this by Professor Louise Ryan, who's a good friend, I think has spoken at this event in the past, and she's written a really important article around how this presentation of these women was used as a way to demonstrate that the kind of republicanism was now totally not okay and was to be ousted kind of from Irish society, and that the winning side, the pro-treaty side, would be the official story from that point on, and anyone who didn't fit into that was deemed to be othered. And for women, they again were kind of really returning to these very sexist, very gendered representations of women as these furies, hysterical women. We see this with the suffrage movement as well. Suffragettes were portrayed in similar ways. So this is very common internationally, not just in Ireland, ways of demonising women who are acting in a different way to what seemed to be the right way to respond to current events. So it was clear, as I say, that my grandmother must have then also been branded as one of these furies and diehards. And what I'm interested in, though, is what happened to these women? What happened to these furies and these diehards? Because they went on to live in the Irish Free State, a Free State that they had, some physically, some through campaigning and activism, really didn't want to see emerge in the way that it did. So for my grandmother, she went on to marry in 1923. As I say, there's a real veil over what happened during the Irish Civil War, and I am hoping to be able to try and find out more about that. But she married in 23, and she had 3 children, including my dad. She was a housewife, as she self-identified on her passport, but she also continued to work as an external examiner in education for the National University of Ireland. She clearly avoided the marriage bar. It's now 50 years since the marriage bar was rescinded in Ireland for the civil service in 1973, but she was doing this while married with children, so she obviously worked around that. I'm not quite sure how. And in that job, she travelled to Cork, Maynooth, and Galway to undertake the work as an external examiner. And so she had young children, but they were middle class, they were quite well off, so they had a housekeeper who minded the children while she went off to do this work. Moreover, she contributed to Irish society post-1922 through her involvement in a number of civil society organisations. So even though she was on the losing side, and even though she remained anti-treaty throughout her whole life, and was still interested in Common the Main right up to, I found some evidence of a survey around Common the Main membership from the late 1960s, so really kind of very close to her death, she engaged fully in Irish society, and these are the women, and these are the women's stories I'm really keen with others to draw out in our new project. So the groups she worked with were had a commonality to improve the social, economic and educational opportunities of women in the Irish Free State. In the early 1930s, she was a member of the Dublin Playgrounds Committee, overseen by the Civics Institute, which worked to provide child guidance, home visiting, playgrounds and nurseries in Dublin. And again, we don't know that much about her involvement in this really interesting organisation, so that's something I'm very keen to find out more about. The Playgrounds Association, its work was stopped, perhaps surprise, surprise, by Archbishop McQuaid, who didn't like the idea of non-Catholic controlled activity supporting families and women and children. So he clamped down on those activities. As I mentioned earlier, Maureen was involved in 2 national women's organisations, the National University Women Graduates Association and the Irish Country Women's Association, the ICA. And you can see from this slide, I'm back on the right slide now, you can see on this slide that she was president of the Women Graduates Association from 1951 to 52, and she was also president of the UCD branch. And alongside this image of the presidents, as you can see on the slide, I hope, are some really well-known women in Irish history. You have Alice Oldman, Professors Mary Hayden, and then Agnes O'Farrelly, who of course was the founder of Common the Main. So all of these networks, you can see, are all working around each other. And that's, you can see my grandmother, I have no idea if she's on the left or the right, but she's on the bottom. So the Women Graduates Association was one of the leading organisations in the campaign against the draft 1937 Constitution, including Article 41.2, which the nation is due to deliberate on if they can sort out some of the wording. I'm not sure where we are with that, but it was supposed to be happening in November. So I've no evidence at the moment if my grandmother was involved in this campaign. And it is interesting that in the speech I referred to earlier, her speech to the 1922 convention, she did say that she is not, and I'm just trying to, I've quoted her here, I'm not an enthusiast of women's rights, which I was thinking, grandmother, not an enthusiast of women's rights. But, there's a but she argued that women had as much right to an opinion as men. So I'm happy. That's okay. I'm happy with that. So, and actually, just as an aside, I mean, that tension between feminism and nationalism was very evident, particularly during the suffrage campaign. Did you put your energies, did you prioritise the women's suffrage campaign, or did you prioritise the campaign for an independent Ireland? And there was lots of disagreements. And again, Louise Ryan has written beautifully about and in detail about those tensions. And there's just a nice connection here. So you've got that great front cover. Any excuse I have to use that in a paper, I get it in there. So this is a cover from the satirical magazine Dublin Opinion in 1937, and you can see De Valera, who of course was one of the key authors of the 1937 Constitution. He's in bed having sweet dreams, and he has some of the female representations of Ireland trying to stab him because of what is a hey big fella about those articles in the Constitution, I think. Sorry, I can't quite remember. So as I said, though, I don't know, so I can't appropriate and say, oh yeah, my grandmother was really supportive of this, because I don't know, but I will try and find out. And I did, just to get a bit of self-promotion here, I'm very keen for Article 41.2 to be taken out of the Constitution, and I wrote an opinion piece for the Irish Times about that when the last time there was supposed to be a referendum, which was in October 2018, and it also got cancelled. But it is quite unbelievable that we as a democratic nation have a constitution which says that a woman's place is in the home, and it's 2023. And my women who campaigned against this in 1937, I mean, they literally would be spinning in their graves if they knew that it was still in the Constitution. And there seems to be just such difficulty in trying to do the wording. That's why, personally, I think just take it out, and that's the end of it. But anyway, we can talk about that and on. So the second national organisation that my grandmother was heavily involved in was the Irish Countrywomen's Association, formerly known as the United Irish Women. And by the 1960s, the ICA was one of the largest women's organisations in Ireland, with 498 guilds and some 15,000 members around the country. My grandmother was a member of the Dublin Town Association, and she supported the work of the ICA in promoting women's educational opportunities. Education is a theme that just runs throughout her life, her interest and support of education. And she had a particular focus on Irish language and Irish literature. In 1953, she was elected vice chair on the ICA's Residential Courses Subcommittee, later renamed the Grianán Committee, and it was this committee that oversaw the purchase, with the financial support of the Kellogg Foundation, and the opening of the ICA's residential college on Grianán in County Louth, which still operates today, and it was the first adult education college for women in Ireland. It's clear, therefore, from her activities that my grandmother's objection to the way that the Irish Free State was established, and her lifelong rejection of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, didn't prevent her from making a significant contribution to the Irish state, later Irish Republic. She did adapt to these new circumstances, and in doing so, she contributed to the enhancement of Irish society in a meaningful way, particularly around the education and welfare of women. So having had this wonderful opportunity to trace my own grandmother's afterlife in the wake of revolution and civil war, I wondered what were all the other women who had been labelled furies and diehards, or who were on the wrong or losing side. What happened to them after 1922? And that's what's led to the Afterlives project. So I decided to seek out some other historians who I knew were thinking along the same lines, and this quickly brought me to Dr. Mary McAuliffe and Dr. Fionnuala Walsh of UCD, whose work I'm sure you're familiar with. From there, we extended out our network to include other key Irish historians, namely Dr. Margaret Ward, Professor Lindsay Erna Byrne, and Dr. Leanne Lane, who in their different ways are interested in the experiences of women in Ireland in the decades after the end of the Civil War and the establishment of the Free State. As luck would have it, we got some seed funding, but that was for an international collaboration, and that led us to think, how could we expand this, and why is it important to see Ireland in the context of other states that have gone through similar experiences? And as a result, we have recruited Professor Ingrid Sharp and Dr. Corinne Painter of the University of Leeds, but they're experts on German women in the revolutionary period and after, and then Dr. Tina Lintunen, who works at the University of Turku in Finland, who has worked on Finnish women in the Finnish Civil War. So there are clear similarities between the experiences of women during and after the Irish revolutionary period with those of Finland and Germany. Finland experienced a revolution and civil war in 1918. It was shorter than the Irish Civil War, but just as destructive. And there are some details which again I can't see on the slide, but you can see for yourselves just some of the key dates. So it was following a revolution, independence from Russia, and then a civil war. Tina's work traces the activities of social red and conservative white women, both during and after the Civil War, and she's created a database of 276 women from one town. So this is micro-history, which is becoming a way in which many of us, particularly social historians, women historians, are finding out about the lives of lesser-known women, doing these kind of micro-histories. In her study, Tina found that white women took up more traditional roles during the Civil War, for example, as nurses, cooks, and cleaners, and red women did likewise, but in addition, some took up arms, as depicted in the photo here, another woman with a rifle. However, only a small number of red women took part in active combat, and they tended to be young single women. And Tina is particularly interested in the 10,000 what were known as service troops. These were older and often married women who carried out more traditional duties, much in the way as Cumann na mBan members did during the War of Independence and the Civil War. Like the Furies in Ireland, women on the losing red side were viewed very negatively in the aftermath of the war. Red widows were not entitled to a widow's pension, unlike the widows of white soldiers. Tina has also looked at the relationship between red mothers and their children, and she's interested in what stories women shared or didn't share with their children about their experiences of wartime and afterwards. So Tina's work very much links with the Afterlives projects as we seek to map the trajectories of women involved in revolution and civil war and what happened to them afterwards. We're interested in learning more about how they absorbed these experiences into their everyday lives and what they shared or withheld from their nearest and dearest. Germany, which you're probably a wee bit more familiar with, experienced a revolution in November 1918 following its defeat in the First World War. The unrest ended in August 1919 with the establishment of the Weimar Constitution and the Weimar Republic. And a number of female revolutionaries are very well known. For example, the Marxist revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, who actually is why I do women's history in the first place. It was as a teenager I came across Rosa Luxemburg and I just thought, this is amazing. And that's what sent me on my path of women's history. And Rosa Luxemburg, of course, was murdered in Berlin in January 1919. So what Ingrid and Corinne Painter seek to do in their research is to draw out these stories in the same way that we're doing in the project of these less well-known German women who went on to live in the new Weimar Republic and make significant contributions to the new state, or who moved elsewhere. So there is always a diaspora to think about too, and made a contribution elsewhere. So you see, for example, here on the slide, you've got Hilda Kramer, who features in this excellent article by Ingrid and Corinne, again in the conversation. And don't worry, I'm not getting any money from the conversation, but it is a great resource. Hilda later fled to the UK in 1937 and became heavily involved in the Labour Party. So Ingrid and Corinne have created, again, a database of 256 women who were involved in the German Revolution and have traced their afterlives. And so we're trying to bring all of these strands of work together in our project to see what some of the comparisons can be. As well as working with these international scholars, we've partnered up with two leading historic Irish women's organisations, the ICA and Seroptimists Ireland. And working with both groups, we're using innovative participatory research methods to co-create and co-produce the research so that we can directly engage their members, the members of both organisations, and encourage them to think about the afterlives of women in their own families, but also in the organisations that they are now members of. And participatory research is really important because it means as academics we aren't coming in as so-called experts and saying, this is what you need to know, this is what you need to do. Instead, we're working alongside and saying, as historians, how can we get you to do what you want to do with your organisation? And that, for me, that's been transformative in my practice in the last 2 years. So the aim and the purpose of working with these organisations in this way is to inform, inspire and safeguard their future activism, and to allow them to continue their fight, which they fight locally, globally and nationally, around gender equality and social justice. So just very quickly, the project, you can I'll just summarise them here, but we have 5 key questions. We want to think about how the participation in conflict influenced women's lives. How did it impact on their life course, the different stages of their lives in Ireland, Finland, Germany. We want to think about the contribution that they made in shaping their communities in the wake of revolution and civil war. We want to think about the extent that these women engaged, particularly in tackling injustice, adversity and inequality. But we're not only looking at that. I mean, some of these women may have gone on and taken up very we could argue, right-wing positions. I mean, there's a number of women in Come the Mo and joined the Blue Shirts. So we're not exclusively looking at, the right-on side of things. We are also open to thinking about other engagement with activism that we may not necessarily agree with. We want to know how, we want to uncover the life stories of these lesser known female activists from 1918 and trace how their engagement with activism contributed to how the society they lived in changed over their life course. And then finally, we want to think about how their stories changed our national histories. So there was an interesting article which I'm going to talk a bit more about tomorrow, by Diarmaid Ferriter in the Irish Times, I think on Friday, talking about local history, but also the importance of the grand narrative. And I would argue we don't need grand narratives anymore, and that we should be just much more interested in how people's lives, how individuals and groups and organisations can influence the national story. And that often isn't in the grand narrative as we know it. So let's ditch the grand narrative. That would be my little plug. Anyway, right. So finally, we're getting there. Finally, so we have held one workshop, as I said, at UCD, and we've made a podcast. This is my first time making a podcast. If anyone listens to the podcast, I'd love you to do so. Very happy to accept constructive criticism, because I want to make them better in the future. And in that podcast, it's myself, Mary McAuliffe and Fionnuala Walsh, and we recorded it at UCD, so it's available on the UCD History Hub, but also wherever you get your podcasts from. And in that, we share our own stories of activist women, but we also, and perhaps more importantly, provide tips of how you can do this at home yourselves. So we have a list of resources. We talk about the way you can access these and how you can overcome some of the challenges of doing family history. And this is why I did speak a bit about my dad and how it was important for me to have his agreement that I was doing this research, because it's a very sensitive area and one has to be very careful how one deals with family history. And before going into that, one needs to think very carefully and think about who might be offended, who has a different perception, who might not know things, and have those conversations. Really important to take the time to do that. So we talk about that on the podcast too. So in the coming months, the project's members, working with the ICA and Sir Optimist Ireland, we want to identify what next. We hope to produce at least one publication. We quite like that to be what's known as a trade book, so it actually be a book people want to read as opposed to an academic book. And maybe a photographic exhibition, because photos are so important in this story of wondering who are these women in these photos that haven't been identified, and other kinds of accessible outputs. To really kind of broaden out and kind of engage more people in these stories. So, as I promised, we have come to the end. There was an end, and thank you all very much for listening. Thank you. Oh, I forgot my plug. Sorry, I forgot my plug. So, and Louise Ryan would never forgive me because she's taught me how to do this well. So there's a book that's on sale at the back, Irish Women in the Vote, Becoming Citizens, edited by Louise Ryan and Margaret Ward, and I have a chapter in that which has a bit about the campaign against the Constitution and the women's movement in the 20s, 30s and 40s. So that's available to buy at the back.
I should also say Louise Ryan and the foreword by Linda Connolly, they've both spoken at the History Festival, so it gets our full endorsement. That was great, Kate. Thank you very much. We've got about 5-10 minutes for questions, if anyone has them. We'll have the mic here.
Hello, thanks very much. The talk was very interesting. Just two questions that strike me as, first of all, did your grandmother speak of De Valera and her opinion of him taking the oath, entering the Dáil, becoming Taoiseach, etc., etc.? Also, De Valera, as I understand it, refused to meet women's organisations before drafting the Constitution. That's number one. Number two, then, I've been doing a bit of research, and I'm from Macroom, and the ICA in Macroom is an absolutely wonderful organisation, really opened my eyes. But one of the hallmarks of the ICA was that it was non-political, non-sectarian and non-religious. Would that, in hindsight, of course, at this stage, have been a better path for the country to pursue, rather than going down even the War of Independence, the Civil War, the bitterness that followed, and so on and so forth? And I think that's a regressive step. But the ideals of the United Irish Women seem to me they had the nail in the head. It also was frowned upon by the Catholic Church because it was not a Catholic organisation, but eventually it was accepted, and within the constraints of conservatism and a very dark and grey Ireland from the 1920s to the 1960s, it did absolutely wonderful work.
Thank you. So, on my grandmother's views of Dev, I don't, and sadly, I don't know. And this is one of the things I think I said in the podcast, and I'm sure everyone feels this way. Sometimes if you could just magic back some of your now deceased relatives or friends, just to ask them. So I don't know, but I would, as I say, a lot of this has just emerged quite recently, and I do hope to do more research. So I would really like to know her. I suspect she thought very little of him, but I can't say, I can't speak on her behalf because I don't know. That was on Deb. That was the ICA. It wouldn't have been amazing if we didn't have had the Civil War, the War of Independence. I mean, it's a huge question, but yeah, of course, no one wants to have armed conflict. The ICA is a wonderful organisation, and I mean, it was constrained though. So I did an interview when I was doing my MA back in '88. I did an interview with Kathleen Delap from the ICA, and she spoke about how they had to cower to the Catholic clergy because they were dependent on the local Catholic priest to have a place to meet and also to have members. So they couldn't, although many of the members, especially because a lot of middle class women, quite a lot of Protestant women as well joined the ICA, that they were privately using birth control, but they couldn't talk about it in ICA meetings because they would be banned. So, and the local branch shut down. So it worked within the constraints of a much broader, more complex, patriarchal, traditional, conservative Irish society. So as brilliant as the ICA were, I'm just not sure that they could have broken the chains of patriarchy at that time, because of just the 90% Irish Catholic, devout Catholic. It just wasn't going to happen. It's happened now though, so that's good.
There's a question
A bit.
in the front row. Sorry, no, just down here. There's a lady in the front row. Thank you.
Thank you very much. An amazing talk. I'm just wondering, your dad and his siblings, it's just so interesting that you're unearthing all this information now. Did your grandmother not talk to them at all or have any stories? And sorry, second to that, and linking to your sister's talk early this morning, are there any, apart from the photos, are there any other objects? Because the objects I thought that were so fascinating are the little elements or shoes or clothes or anything like that. So does she have any of those left behind?
Yes, so I was just fuming because I actually have her come in the mum badge, which one of my cousins very kindly gave to me once I started doing this work. And another aspect of family history is it really reignites your relationship with your family and your extended family. So I now have relationships with my cousins that I haven't had for years, apart from when we were kids. It's been really, really very meaningful. But Murren, one of my cousins, she had the Come in the Mum badge. She had her watch and a ring, a signet ring, and she gave them all to me, which is amazing. Sorry, Helen, I took them. This is where you have to be. This is where you have to be quite careful and negotiate these things. So just be warned, you know. On the stories, yeah. So I think it's an interesting. So my dad had 2 older sisters, both now are deceased. My aunt Helen, whose son Eamon did some. He and I contributed to the Dictionary of National Biography profile on my grandmother, which again is available online. So his mum she talked a lot about her mother, and he would have stories, and I'm just starting to gather some of those stories now. I have some letters as well that my cousins have shared, so it's opened up this whole thing of sharing of documents. And what's wonderful now with digital technology is you don't have to get into those awkward conversations about who owns what documents. You just take a photograph of it and you have it, and then it's all fine, you know, so you don't have that. So I think if I go back to on thinking about your question, I must check with my cousin Eamon, because he may have more insight into my grandmother's view of De Valera than I would. My dad, I think, was particularly reticent, and I just think he really he struggled with this representation of his mother, which was one that he didn't feel comfortable with. You know, he would in no way have supported armed nationalism. So it was very difficult for him, I think. And that's why I'm so glad that when I did explain to him that I wasn't just looking at that and at that photo, I was looking at her whole life. And we all have different parts of our lives. And I think as historians as well, we need to look at the whole lives of individuals and not just the minute they were famous, that moment that they were in the limelight. It's much more interesting, for me anyway, to trace it right on to the end. So, but I am hoping to find out more, you know, and do some of that. Again, this is just all quite new that I have this chance. That's why I conveniently organised a whole project around it, so I can do work on my own granny.
We've got literally 2 minutes. So Ewan, I think.
Thanks very much. Just briefly, in this exercise, not only in terms of Ireland, but internationally, 2 things. I think class is social class is a big element that you have to use for interrogation. Another thing is be careful what you wish for. Like you, both my grandmothers were involved in coming on in the independence movement. One of them, Cathy Vary, was very prominent. She was very much in favour of women's rights generally. She was this, that, and the other. Refused to speak to De Valera after he founded Fianna Fáil and all that stuff. She was also, as probably your grandmother was if she was an out-and-out Republican, very pro-Nazi. Right? So when you move to the international, shades of this morning, Robert was saying about the Ukraine, where it's still argued by Moscow that the Ukrainians are Nazis, you get this paradox of nationalism and those kind of things, cross-cutting, what appear in retrospect to be very progressive views on social life and so on. Yeah. I think also there is, with Cumann and their ilk, my grandmother, some of her other sisters were also very much involved afterwards in Republican progressive organisations. But there is the element of class and the element of, in a sense, helping, looking down, implicitly looking down on the sort of the ignorant masses and so on.
Yeah, I think those are two very good points. I don't think my grandmother was a Nazi. But again, I'm not sure. But I'm being facetious. But I think the issue of class is first of all, if you're going to do family history, exactly as you say, you have to be braced for good news and bad news, and you may not like the person. But in my own professional practice, I research very conservative women's organisations. I wouldn't join those organisations, but I'm fascinated about what they did for women and how they improved women's lives. So you don't have to like the people that you research, and I think you just, you don't do it then. If you're not willing to face up to the truths you might uncover. And obviously this is very particularly relevant to countries where there's been civil war, and I'm thinking of where, indeed, in Germany, of course, where there was the Holocaust. If you're going to go looking, you need to just accept what you may find. You can't hide it. So that would be my point. On class, I think absolutely. On the panel I'm speaking about in the morning, we've been asked to think about what's kind of been missing. And I think class is absolutely, because my grandmother, clearly a very highly educated, middle-class woman. She didn't apply for her military pension. She would have been entitled to one, I think, but she didn't apply for one. It may have been a political act to say, I'm not going to take that from the Free State, but also she didn't need to, because she was quite comfortably off. So she didn't have that financial, she wasn't a working class woman. It would be a very different experience otherwise. So yeah, I think class sometimes can get forgotten in a lot of these conversations. Nationalism, indeed even feminism, can overtake class, but class is always there. and is hugely significant. So yeah, we need to look at the class.
Very quick question from Mark on the end there, because we've got 5 minutes till the next talk.
Sorry, just very briefly, can you explain more about your father's reluctance to talk about this, and how much of it was coloured by his political beliefs, and how much of it was coloured by the fact that talking about his mother at the time would have been set against the backdrop of the post-69 troubles?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's why I think the Decade of Centenaries is so important, because I think absolutely, and, you know, my mother was from Northern Ireland, so my mother, his wife, was from Northern Ireland, she was from Tyrone. We used to go up in the 70s all the time. We used to get stopped by the soldiers and the car search and all of those kind of things. So we were very, very close quarters with what was happening in the Troubles. And I think, yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's a complex. I can't really go into it because, you know, it's obviously, you know, I can't psychoanalyze my dad. I think, you know, obviously other people have relationships with their parents. But I think it was his mother, and he didn't associate her with her coming them on. I mean, when, you know, this is when she was 23, you know, years before she was born, and that wasn't just what his memory of his mother was. But I think he was cautious, and he would have been. He would have been very open. He was a very empathetic and a very sensitive man, and I think he would have worried that other people would be upset by him, you know, I don't know, boasting or whatever, that his mum was in Coming them On and a Republican. I think he was very cognizant of other people's feelings, and I think that's one of the reasons why. But as I say, I'm really privileged that we had those conversations, and that, you know, he was 90 when he died, but you know, it's hugely meaningful that, you know, he came around to it. And I think when he understood that we weren't only going to look at that bit of her life, you know, that it's so important, her whole life, I think he got it, and then he was at peace with her. Yeah.
That's a good note to end. So thank you again to Kate.
Thank you.